So we're going to start with the video. Sorry about that.
I despised myself from pretty much close to getting out of the womb. I was always wrong. Let's start with that. When you're always wrong, you seek an audience to disprove that theory. I was just hell-bent on having to prove myself. I know I'm right. I can't be always wrong, you know. I was the victim.
My father was a very strange man. He was kind of a performance artist that was fueled by beer.
I was very shy, and at home I was always quiet and didn't get to speak very often just because other people were jibber-jabbering a lot, you know. Some people wouldn't clam up, Mom. When I did different voices or different noises, people say, that's weird, or shut up. I feel like there's a fear of seeming crazy.
A lot of...
Well, hello, and welcome to the second episode of Propositivity podcast. And so I wanted to open up with a quick little video or audio clip of some comedians discussing their personal experiences with depression, anxiety, and just growing up in general and creating comedy from their lifestyle. And so I wanted to focus this episode on what depression looks like. So overall, I've heard people say, oh, how can you be depressed? Oh, how can you have depression? Oh, hey, Gene, what do you mean? You're popular. And so it was always weird for me because when I was in high school, people did say, "Oh, Gene, you have a lot of friends." Like, I don't get it. Like, what do you have to be sad about? And that's not how depression works. It doesn't matter how many people associate with me. It doesn't matter how many people know my name. To me, they weren't real connections. It was constantly this feeling of isolation. And so, Richard Lewis, the first comedian that spoke in that audio, he says, I despised myself from pretty much close to getting out of the womb. And that quote really just resonated with me because that feeling of being always wrong, of being me against the world and kind of like I was losing, that was something that really resonated with me. And I was someone who was very outgoing and who still is very outgoing and social. So it was very interesting for me to hear the comedian that I admire and respected talk about mental illness in that way. And so as I started researching, I started to think about all these people that were suffering from mental illness. And one that comes to mind in particular is Mac Miller. And he's someone who people didn't necessarily know was going through all these different things. But sure enough, in 2018, he died from an overdose of fentanyl. And it shocked people, especially people my age, because here was this guy who grew up and created a career for himself. He had all the money in the world, and he ended up dying from an overdose of fentanyl. And you start to listen to some of his music, and his song in particular, Self-Care, in which, in the music video, he's literally buried underground. And he's talking about self-care in a way, but he's smoking a cigarette, and he's reenacting the scene from Kill Bill Volume 2, in which she's buried underground and she punches her way out. And it's just very it's very chilling to kind of watch from the perspective that we have now, that he was going through that. He was going through all that depression. He was going through that period where he was feeling buried. Avicii, another artist who committed suicide because He was tired of his fame. He was tired of his partying lifestyle, and it had already almost killed him. So he just kind of gave up. I have an article here about the Anthony Bourdain, who was another influential person. He was a chef who passed away in 2018 due to suicide. And it says in here that people didn't know what was going on with him. They were wondering why. How could he commit suicide? How could he have died? He was a man who traveled to 265 days a year. And people didn't understand that he was someone who was struggling through all this time. He was someone who was going through a really dark period. He was someone who was ultimately depressed and had a lot of struggles in his life. People didn't understand that he was an addict. People didn't know that he was a recovering addict. People didn't know that he used to abuse crack cocaine. And people didn't understand that he was depressed, and he spoke about it. And he said that he sat down with a therapist, and he mentioned that something as simple as a hamburger could trigger a spiral of his depression. That's something that's amazing to me, to think about this person who is a chef, who is a world-renowned chef, who travels all over the world, spends all of his time exploring what the things that he's so passionate about, but behind all of it is this underlying, deep-rooted depression. I have a clip from another comedian who ended up committing suicide, and this one is Robin Williams, and he discusses how he turned his sadness and his addiction into art, and he uses his comedy as a way to cope. So listen to this.
Perhaps it was no coincidence that Robin Williams' HBO tour was called Weapons of Self-Destruction.
Ta-da! You are an alcoholic. And some people say, Robin, I'm a functioning alcoholic. It is, you can be one. It's like being a paraplegic lap dancer. You can do it. Just not as well as the others, really.
And perhaps it was no coincidence either that Williams did that tour in 2009, a year after a major operation.
Please, I've had heart surgery, thank you.
Surgery that he says triggered mood swings.
After the surgery, you get very emotional. It's like weird. People go, how are you? Thanks for asking.
For Williams, it was all fair game.
When I was growing up, they used to say, Robin, drugs can kill you. Now that I'm 58, my doctor's going, Robin, you need drugs to live.
Raw, honest, self-deprecating humor in which Williams shares with the world his struggles with alcohol and drugs.
I had a little problem with alcohol. It wasn't really a problem. Everybody had it. But it was the idea.
You were
Yeah, I was a drunk.
you were a drunk. Now, do you think you've beaten it?
Oh, it's always there.
You've beaten it.
Yeah, I kicked you.
No, fine.
No, the idea is that you always have a little bit of fear, like you have to just keep at it. You know, it's a day by day.
In 1982, as a young comedian, Williams famously partied with pal John Belushi, hours before the Blues Brothers star overdosed on heroin and cocaine.
Cocaine, what a wonderful drug. Anything that makes you paranoid and impotent, give me more of that.
Williams soon quit cold turkey and remained sober nearly 2 decades until 2003, then relapse and rehab, here in 2006 for comic relief.
It's always good for me to come to Vegas after rehab. I love that.
It's a good town for you.
A good town for me. It's like going to Colombia, you know. Where are you going for detox? Colombia. Just to take it easy in a 24-hour alcohol town.
In 2008, when his second marriage ended as a result of alcoholism, he says, Williams again went to rehab joking about it with U.S. troops.
I was violating my standards quicker than I could lower them.
Wherever he went, it seems there was always laughter. But with that came unbearable pressure. William suffered manic depression.
No, I'm not always fun to be around, and that there is this thing of, the world sees one thing, and what am I like at home? Different, because I can't always be on.
Surrounded by millions who adored him, loved him, yet in the end, could not save him.
Good night!
Deborah Thayerick, CNN, New York.
And so, to me, it was always extremely interesting to have someone who was one of the biggest comedians, who I watched in Aladdin as a child, play the genie, granted Aladdin all of his wishes, and then now he's dead due to suicide. It blew my mind how someone who could be so happy on the outside yet still struggle so hard on the inside. So I found an article, and essentially this article discusses that people with greater depressive symptoms report more frequent negative social interactions and react more strongly to them. It remains unknown, however, whether reaction strength differs depending on whether social interactions are positive or negative. Basically, it's talking about how our social interactions as people who suffer from depression can have such a strong impact on us. And so these people who go out there and they put themselves out there, then they use their kind of illness as a shield. They're still going to be hurt if somebody takes that and uses it against them. I'm someone who's very vocal, who's very social, who's very open about things that bother me. So I've grown to learn that other people are not going to see that, and they're not going to see that as a good, and they're going to see that as a weakness that they can try to exploit. And I've had people try to exploit it and try to use my past against me, or use certain things against me, who have called me a freak for being an alcoholic at 19. And I've learned to kind of get a thick skin, but these things, you can see the effect it has on a person with depression. If you know anyone who suffers from depression, they will tell you probably about social interactions that you think are minute, but to them it feels a lot more. Everything feels deeper. Everything feels more draining. And so there really is, overall, no look to what depression is. There's no way to see depression necessarily, because somebody could be like Robin Williams, somebody can be like Anthony Bourdain, they can be traveling around the world, they can be making people laugh every day, and on the inside they're still suffering, and they're going through these struggles every single day. So I think that the biggest thing that I've come to realize in my time is that it's important to be vocal about these things. I brought up my parents in the first episode of this podcast, and I said that they are two people that encouraged me to speak. And although when I was going through my lowest periods, I really didn't want to speak, I didn't want to talk to people, I found that ultimately speaking about my issues with someone helped. So I think that ultimately talk therapy was one of the things that helped me the most at the time. Right now I'm no longer in talk therapy. I feel as though I don't necessarily need talk therapy as much as I can rely on my support system now. But talk therapy was something that helped me a lot. Eventually seeing a psychiatrist and getting medicated helped me a lot. So someone who I've been listening to a lot lately. Oh, hold on. Something's going haywire. Someone who I've been listening to a lot lately is Amy Winehouse. And Amy Winehouse, you can kind of see a little more of the depressive aspects in her songs. You can see the hurt and the addiction and the alcoholism. She has her song Rehab, where they try to make me go to rehab, and I say no. she's someone who it was more evident, but wasn't ultimately able to be helped. Although she had this fame, although she had opportunities to change, it wasn't enough to help her. Someone like Demi Lovato, who has suffered from relapses. I bring it back to Robin Williams and how he says it's a constant fight. It's a day-to-day struggle. Addiction is a day-to-day struggle. Depression is a day-to-day struggle. We take it day by day, and we take it as it comes. As life hits us, we try to get back up, and we continue to get back up. And I think that's the most important lesson we can learn. There are a lot of people who weren't able to make it. There were a lot of people who had this exterior that seemed so positive, but ultimately it's important to not only reach out yourself and to get help, but also to see those people and understand that they can still have depression, and if they talk about it, then it is a real issue. You should always be willing to listen to someone who's going to talk about their depression or talk about something that they suffer from. I have so many people in my life that I get to thank every day, or thank every time I see them, for helping me through periods of my life in which I talked to them and they took it seriously. They didn't say, "Oh, Gene, like, what do you mean?" There were some people who said, "Gene, I don't get it. I don't get how you can be depressed." And to those people, I told them, I said, "This is a mental illness. This is something we work through. This is something that I don't necessarily like to show everyone." The times where I was most depressed, I liked to isolate. Sort of like sort of like they spoke about in the first clip. They said, we like to isolate. We like to... I think I actually might have cut that out. Here it is. Let me just play that one more time. I'm gonna mute the commercial, but overall what he's saying is this thing about isolation and this thing about being introverted, and the one thing they can do is they can be that person. They can strip themselves bare on the stage, and they can isolate themselves in a way that they, when they're outside of it, that helps them to cope with what they're dealing with. Let me just play that one more time. God. Alright, I'm just going to play that really quick. There we go. So, let me get back to my recording. Get out of here. So the thing that I focus on in all of this is the fact that these people do have these feelings and they are suffering from them behind closed doors, and it's how do you help that? How do you reach out to those people, and how do you find out what's going on? And so the number one thing that I've always found is to ask, are you okay? It's as simple as that. Say, how are you today? How are you actually doing? What is going on in your life? And so every person who knows me and who's well connected with me knows that I reach out to so many people, random people that I've had connections with a long time ago, people that I'm not necessarily friends with anymore. I reach out and I say, hey man, how's it going? How are things? Because I like to try and make those connections and make sure people feel open and feel like they have a resource in me. I post my phone number, I post my email, I post on Propositivity and tell my story so that other people can see and other people can understand that this is what I'm going through and you might be going through the same, and I'm here to talk. Overall, that's the number one thing that I would say is just, if you are willing to help and if you do want to help, then you need to try and be open about your issues. But if you can't do that, at the very least, try and dig deeper. Try to understand what someone else is going through. Try to understand what you might be able to do to help. We need to make a effort these days to try and connect with people and try to get deeper in our relationships. There's so many surface level relationships or just Facebook friend relationships. And ultimately, those relationships need to be deeper so that other people who are suffering can feel like they can come out and talk about these things. If they feel that they can talk about it, then they'll be able to work on themselves. They'll be able to get the help that they need. I want to help other people. And so that's why I'm so open about my issues, and that's not going to be the same for everyone. That's not going to be the same for most people. But if you can just try and reach out to someone this week, try to reach out to someone this month, and try to reach out to your friends and family and make sure that you're asking them, are they okay, to actually listen about their lives and listen to what's going on, you might be able to help them through a serious struggle. So, the overall point of this episode was to go over the look of depression. And the point is there is no look. There is no sadness necessarily that can be seen from the outside. There's joking humor. There's self-deprecating humor that you can try to ask, hey, what's really going on? You can try to stop people from being so self-deprecating. And I've tried to correct myself in that manner and try to stop myself from acting that way. But at the end of the day, there's not a look to depression. There's no way to say, hey, that person's depressed. You might be able to see them acting low. You might be able to see them when they're in a depressive state, but there's no way to say it's definitively who has depression and who doesn't. You might be able to identify when someone is going through a depressive episode because of how their mood is, how their energy is. But overall, the point is just make sure to ask people and to try and get your relationships to people to a point where you can learn about them and can learn what they're going through. If you can get to that point with your friends and your family, then you might be able to make the world a better place. I know anyone who's listening to this understands that that's my goal and that's my ambition, and I hope that you feel similar, and that we're in this world together and we should try to make each other feel comfortable in this world, that we should try to better the world before we leave it. I do want to say these famous people who went through these moments, these famous people who are no longer with us, it affects me deeply when I read about these things, when I see these things. And the only reason I bring it up in this episode is to talk about the fact that they were suffering and we couldn't necessarily have known from the outside, from the public perspective. And I pray to them. I pray for their families. I pray for every person that's going through these hard times and isn't willing or isn't necessarily able to stop it. Robin Williams went to rehab multiple times. He was public about his issues, and still ultimately he couldn't be saved. And it's a sad thing to think about. And I don't want to see more people feel that they can't beat it or feel that they have no other option, because ultimately that's the only reason that someone ends their life, is because they don't see another option anymore. They can no longer live with that pain. I'm here to say that I'm with you, that God is with you, and that there are many people who listen to this who will be willing to listen to you. If you're going through a tough time, reach out to someone you love. Reach out to a parent, to a relative, to a sibling, to a friend. Tell them that you love them. And make sure to try and get out some of those feelings. If you need to talk about something, go to a therapist if you can. If you feel like if you feel suicidal, call the suicide hotline. I'm someone who called before. I called a few times, and it helped me. It really did. Just to hear someone who was willing to listen to me helped me tremendously. Anyways, I want to wrap up this podcast. I want it to be a little shorter than the first episode, but overall, I just want to say that you are a good person. No matter who's listening to this, you are a good person. You are worthy of life. You deserve to be alive, and whatever you're going through, I hope that you're willing to discuss it. If you think you can beat it on your own, I pray that you can, but for most of us who go through mental illness, we need help. And that's not admitting weakness. That's a strength. To ask for help is strong, because you are admitting that you can't do it alone. And that's more terrifying than going through anything, is admitting that we need help. So I'd just like to say thank you everyone for listening. I appreciate you. I appreciate all the people that support me, and I appreciate everyone that supports Propositivity. If you would like, you can contribute to Propositivity. You can write an article, or you can talk to me about being on my podcast. But either way, I just want to say that I appreciate you. I appreciate the support. And overall, there is no look to depression. There is no look to mental illness. Many people you know are suffering from depression, and you would never guess it. Many people you know are suffering from mental illness, and you would never even think about it. You would think, oh my God, that person is the funniest person. And in reality, they could be suffering more than anyone you know. So try and reach out to people. Try and make those connections, and try and be an ear to listen to. And try to be an ear for them to bend. Try to be someone who can help others. Anyways, I appreciate you. I hope you have a wonderful week. And thank you so much for listening to my podcast. Have a nice day. Have a nice week. Have a nice life. Stay positive. Goodbye. Oh my God. That was a lot. That was a rough one. Oh well. Stay positive.